Welcome to Book Club, but it's Doki Doki Literature Club instead. Today we are going to be discussing the game Doki Doki Literature Club. It's not just going to be like a review or a reactions thing. We are going to do that sort of stuff briefly, but we're going to try and go a bit more in depth with it. We wanted to sort of take other mediums a bit more seriously, like video games in particular. But we're also going for other stuff. So this is going to be our first episode. And, yeah. Andrew, you got anything you want to add?
No. So I feel like we should start with a little bit about ourselves, seeing it's the first episode. So my name's Andrew. I am 23, have a brief history with psychology in college. But other than that, I find video games to be a very interesting medium due to the fact that in comparison to other forms of media or art, they tend to be overlooked while being the most interactive form of media. And one of the main reasons we wanted to do this podcast is due to the fact that with this medium being fairly overlooked, hasn't been too many deep dives into the medium in relation to how psychology, sociology, philosophy, any real thought-provoking questions or ideas, you don't see many discussions in those regards on this medium.
Right, it's still a
So we
very
decided,
young medium.
so we decided to go ahead and make Book Club Butt, so that way we could go ahead and discuss these ideas, get some other people interested in it as well, so we can start having these overarching large discussions about interesting points, as well as just talk about how things like mechanics within a video game help really sell an overarching narrative, opposed to just reading through a book. It's all of your imagination. It's a great thing, but at the end of the day, a video game portrays it the way it specifically wants to and doesn't leave it as open to interpretation. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at some of the small nuances that these games provide.
I am Jaff. I'm 27. I have a BA in philosophy. So this is basically all I'm qualified to do. And pretty much everything Andrew said, video games are a very young medium. And compared to things like film and text and other visual and textual arts, there's a lot of controversy around it as to whether or not it has even the capability of being artistic. I know there's this whole thing with authorship that is a bit tricky. But yeah, the general idea is that while this episode we're not really going to be taking the high art question on board, we're going to just sort of try and apply a generally aesthetic lens where we analyze stuff like this in much the similar way that if you were to get together and do a book club on a thought-provoking book with some friends, you come up with the same sort of thoughts. And then Andrew and I are each going to, whenever we do something like this, we do a bit of research on our own. We do a little bit of discussing of stuff that we both talk about. We each are going to have our own points. And also, in the future, we're going to be bringing on guests to see what they think about everything as well. So, before we dive right into Doki Doki Literature Club, I do want to get some warnings out of the way. First, obviously, this is going to very much be spoiling everything that happens in the game, or at least significant parts of it. If you have not played Doki Doki Literature Club, I would recommend pausing the video or podcast or whatever you're experiencing this on right now. Just go and download it. It's a free game from Team Salvato. It's not very long. You can play it in a couple hours, and it's a very interesting game. I would definitely recommend trying the game before listening to this, assuming that you haven't already. I figure most people have played it. It's not a very new game. And that's actually going to be one of the things that I'm going to talk about in just a second. But outside of spoilers, I also want to mention that we are going to be covering some sensitive topics in this game. Self-harm, depression, and suicide are all going to be brought up. And there's also going to be some mentions of general abuse and abuse of power. So if any of these are particularly sensitive subjects to you, just let it be known that that's going to be going forward, so proceed with caution. Alright, so Let's get to our first initial thoughts on the game. Andrew, you played it most recently for the first time. What did you think of Doki Doki Literature Club?
Yes. So you introduced me to this game a while back. I downloaded it and just kind of wrote it off as, oh, it's some other visual novel game. I'm going to sit there and there might be 15 minutes of really enjoyable content. But other than that, it's going to be your general droning on, clicking, and going through a fairly uninterested story. And boy, was I wrong.
Yes.
So Doki Doki Literature Club, one of the ways that I like to describe it is I feel like in certain mediums, a lot of times there's good descriptors being left in there. The first initial start of the run through, when it's still all fun and dandy, there was a quote said by Sayori about the book club itself and describing what the Doki Doki Literature Club is about. And I feel that the initial parts of the game, this quote describes really well. And it's about expressing your feelings, being intimate with yourself, finding new horizons, and having fun. And I feel that ties the first portion of the game together very, very well. Because it's very lighthearted. It's still got the nuances of a dating simulator, but it's not anything.
You got the traditional tropes of the curvy girl, the sort of very petite girl that's very mean, a bit tsundere, and you've got the classic best friend. All your standard tropes.
Yeah, and you got Monica. So
very straightforward, dating sim visual novel sort of thing. And
exactly. And then, so then you get hit with all these turns. And another quote within the first part of this game that is, in my opinion, the most accurate portion of foreshadowing that this game could have ever thrown at you that you'll only realize once you get halfway through. The character Yuri, when describing one of the books that you read within the game, says this line, and it's very obvious foreshadowing, that is, isn't it amazing how a writer can so deliberately take advantage of your own lack of imagination to completely throw you for a loop? And if that quote does not define this game, there's something wrong with the way you're looking at this game.
Yeah. So what we're basically talking about here is one of the first points about the game that I wanted to bring up, which is its subversive nature. We're still talking about some initial things. Doki Doki Literature Club, for those of you that are deciding to listen to this but haven't played it yet, starts out very much as a typical dating sim, and then you take your first initial turn when it turns out that Sayori, your best friend character, has depression, and that shortly thereafter, has its own set of things that could lead to a very interesting game. And basically, the depression thing was set up to lead to, not long later, her taking her own life. And that's another really big change in general expectations for such a lighthearted theme. I know there are plenty of visual novels that cover very dark and serious themes as well, but what is different about Doki Doki Literature Club is what happens after the suicide. The main character mentions that this isn't a game you can't just go back and load a save file. You can't take it back. This is, he's going to have to live with this for the rest of his life. And then the game starts over, and you can take it back. Sort of. What happens is Sayori no longer exists. And you run through Doki Doki Literature Club with just Monica, Yuri, and Natsuki, who are the other three characters. There's a show, I didn't watch much of it because I feel like a lot of the effect of it was lost on me, called Madoka Magica or something like that. But there are a lot of subversive works in general that basically do as Andrew was alluding to earlier, where it expects you to expect a certain set of tropes and then uses those tropes against you to basically catch attention, evoke emotions, make a statement, that sort of thing. Doki Doki Literature Club is definitely one of those games that's all about subverting expectations. The Madoka Magica, my understanding is it was very much a subverting expectation show because everyone thought it was just going to be a standard magical girl anime, and then it very much wasn't standard. But one of my thoughts was like for subversive works like these, do you think there's like an issue with them in experiencing them, right? Like I managed to twist your arm into playing Doki Doki Literature Club, and you basically got to experience Doki Doki Literature Club as it's intended. You went in expecting the standard, and you didn't get it. That didn't happen with me. I was generally aware that Doki Doki Literature Club was not a very standard game whatsoever. I knew that stuff was going to be happening once I started playing it. And I know that's true for a lot of people. In particular, a lot of people that don't normally play games like this or watch shows like Madoka Magica or, watch certain movies or read books of various types. The subversive works require people to go into them in sort of a good faith blind entrance to get the full impact.
I agree with that. I think a game like Doki Doki or any type of medium that takes that approach really is going ahead and, even though it sounds predatory when it's not, it's preying on its consumers' ignorance to go ahead and get the full impact. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. So, for example, if you were to go and purchase a car, a lot of the time people are going to go ahead and make sure you do your research beforehand. And a car salesman is going to go ahead and try and take advantage of you not knowing things. In this example, a game, you're generally not going to go ahead and try and research it because when you know there's an overarching story involved, you don't want to ruin it for yourself. So by going in blind to that and not doing the research, it's easy to go ahead and overlook a few things like the note within the Steam description about how there's very serious themes. Or when you first boot up the game, it has a warning about that it's not suited for children.
Mm-hmm. Or people that
it's easy to
themes.
Yes, it's easy to go ahead and overlook these things when you have a set of expectations and not wanting to go ahead and ruin something for yourself. And I think if it was going ahead and being predatory by trying to take advantage, and if it just sprung this on you without these hints of saying it's not suited for lighthearted individuals or young children, then it could be a problem. But by going ahead and giving these warnings, but doing it in a way where you see it's there, but you're able to overlook it, I feel like that's a way to go about it because it hints that there's more to this without ruining any of the experience.
And a lot of it's very easy to like camouflage. For example, something like this, like especially in a modern society where people are very interested in subversive works. I think that's a big part of it. So you can go to Doki Doki Literature Club, see that warning at the beginning, and catch that it's going to be a subversive work, but think that the subversion of the work is that it's going to be very cutesy on the outside, and then the subversion is that it's a game that primarily deals with dark themes. And that's very much where it feels like the game is going when you talk to Sayori about her depression of the first time. This very much felt like a game. Like when that first came up, that's what you that's why you thought we should do this.
Absolutely.
A quote here actually that you said. Let's see, it was gameplay thoughts. I don't know if I wrote down the exact thing, but basically that was your whole your idea was that this was an interesting game to play because it dealt with themes of depression that normally these sorts of games don't. And for those of you unaware, that is not why Doki Doki Literature Club is a subversive game. The subversion of it is that it knows it's a game in a very interesting way. Like, it does the standard thing where it breaks the fourth wall occasionally to play for jokes. Like the president, who's the one character that you don't romance in the game, Monica, makes references to like saving the game and knowing when basically makes an allusion to like if you want to be able to save multiple times and go back and do things, a big choice is about to come up, that sort of thing. Andrew actually specifically said that he liked her occasionally joking about it, but he didn't like that it was worked into her actual poem in the game. One of the parts of the game is that the characters exchange poems that they wrote. But it's not just cute fourth wall breaking. It's not just a method of conveying the mechanical information. The reason that these fourth wall breaks happen from Monica is because Monica is the character in the game that is aware she is in a game. The reason that Sayori disappears after she kills herself and you go through and run a new game is because Monica literally deletes her character file.
And that's one thing I wanted to go ahead and touch on about this game. I feel that this game is very interesting due to the fact that it touches on a mechanic that not many things do, where it interacts with files outside of just the physical window of the game you're playing.
So I'm going to jump in real quick because that is one of the points that we're going to talk about a bit later. One of the other first impressions I have that sort of segues from that is the sheer depth of the game. As Andrew alluded to, the game does have you interact with character files, which is very interesting. And if you go into the folder and look at the different things, each of the 4 girls has a character file. But the thing is, there's no such thing as a character file. But what people have found out is that these character files are actually other file types, but just renamed so that they say character file. One of them is an image, one of them is just like hex notes that you have to translate. The most interesting one, I think, is Sayori. Sayori is actually an audio file that you have to run through one of those audio graphing programs where you can see what the wavelengths and all that are. And in that program, it is a QR code that you have to scan. And when you do that, it takes you to a very simple, just plain text website of some interesting data. It's very easy to find. It's out there on the internet if you want to look it up. I don't really want to go into all of the details about it right now. There's some interesting theories about it, but that's just one of the things I thought was really interesting. It goes to that extreme depths, and that's not something other media can easily do. Like, there's some stuff in this game that other media can easily do. For example, at one point in the game, in the background, if you pay close attention, one of the posters in the back of the classroom is replaced with a screenshot of the scene where Sayori killed herself. And that's like a sort of like a Fight Club-esque psychological messing with you type of secret. But then there are also more traditional secrets where, for example, if you pay close enough attention to, again, I'm going to give a brief warning, descriptors of suicide. When Sayori kills herself, she does so by hanging, but when you look at her hanging, you notice, if you choose to look at it, her hands are bloody. And this implication is later confirmed, but the idea that it's trying to convey before the game outright comes out and says it, is that she didn't successfully kill herself by hanging. She didn't jump from high enough to break her neck. So she basically panicked and tried to pull herself up off the noose, and that's why her hands were all torn up and bloody. And that's something that you can include in visual media. Like, that's a very minor detail that comes back around. That happens all the time in, like, film and TV. It's very difficult to do something like that in text. Technically, it is possible. There are some very, very subtle ways of doing it. For example, in one of the Harry Potter books, I don't know if this actually ended up being the truth or not, but in the 4th Harry Potter book, they are talking about how 4th or 5th, I think it was the 5th Harry Potter book, they're going through a cabinet of in like an old relative of someone, and briefly mentioned is a locket or a pendant or something like that. And later on, there were some thoughts that was a Horcrux that they just sort of like saw and tossed to the side. I don't think that ended up being what it is, but that's an example of a very subtle thing you can do. You can throw in a throwaway detail amongst other details in text. You can put something in the background or very subtly in visual media. But the character file thing, that is something that is... You could technically do something like that with, a DVD, right? You could have a DVD where you load it up and there are actually secret files on it. But there is one that I feel like this secret is exclusive to an interactive media, which is... There's one screen later on in the game where the background is tilting. And it's not like rapidly tilting. You have to actually wait a significant amount of time until you notice. Like, it takes like a minute or two for you to actually even notice that it's tilting. And if you wait even longer, it just keeps tilting and tilting and tilting. And that's something that's very easy to breeze through if you're just reading the text and moving forward. So that's something that's very easily missable in a normal experience of the game. Braid is another game that has a mechanic that's similar to this. There's a secret where you have to go on a cloud that you can ride. That cloud seems to be stationary. The truth is, it's actually moving incredibly slowly, and you basically have to get on that cloud, speed time up, and even then still wait a very long time for it to move across the screen so you can jump somewhere to get a secret. That I think is even off screen, so you don't even know that it's something you're supposed to do. So things like that are kind of unique to video games, in a sense. Do you have any other examples of that, Andrew?
Not the interactive secrets in particular, but I did want to go ahead and take a moment to touch on the way that the game plays out. We touched on the fact that it starts off in this very lighthearted dating sim manner, and takes a turn when it's revealed that Sayori has depression, and not inevitably, I misuse words there, and eventually comes to the point where she ends up taking her own life. And the game restarts, but when the game restarts and plays through without Sayori, a way that it goes ahead and does something that is portrayed almost exclusively through video games is it starts to glitch out because Sayori is made to be your best friend character, and the story is made to have a best friend character. But the game starts to visually glitch and do little bugs because you no longer have the best friend character in this playthrough. And I felt those little glitches, even though it's a slight tidbit of a detail, really help push the fact of taking you from your initial, okay, it's a light dating sim, and oh, something dark happened, to this is an intriguing experience. I need to find out more about what's going to happen. I felt that those little glitches is what the drawing force behind this game started. That was the point of the snowball effect that leads you more and more down the rabbit hole of needing to know what's going to happen. Why is this game glitching out? And how are these characters reacting to something missing?
Yeah, on that same note, after Sayori takes her own life, and you sort of go back and try and start a new file, it says that the Sayori character file is missing, so that's another allusion to it.
Yes, one of the main reasons I remembered this point is because during the first initial playthrough, I had made a comment about how even though you're given choices, I dislike that in most dating sims, including the initial one. It seems that you're pushed towards having a romance with the initial best friend character. Mm-hmm. And the reason that this point stuck with me so much is because on the second playthrough where there is no Sayori, one of the first things that Jaff said is what's nice about this game is that they don't give you one of those annoying best friend characters and try to force her as the love interest.
Yeah, what best friend character? I don't know what you're talking about.
I don't know who you're talking about. This game is Monica. It's only Monica.
Just Monica is the phrasing I think you're looking for.
I'm aware. It is just Monica. It will always be just Monica.
But yeah, there are some other secrets in the game that are really interesting. For example, near the end of the game, when Monica has basically decided that the world is kind of too unstable and deletes all of the other characters in the rest of the game so that you're just in a room where she's staring at you. Not the character in the game, you, the player. She acknowledges you directly. She's got like 4 hours worth of text dialogue written out. So that's definitely something that's not easy for other media to accomplish. like to be able to be like, you can just ignore all 4 hours of this, but it's also there. But the one in particular that I like is um, there's actually a line that she doesn't say in the game. If you open up the specific file where all of this like post game dialogue happens or late game dialogue happens, if you search through it, there's actually a line in there where she basically calls you out for reading this character file and it being kind of invasive because you're kind of reading her thoughts without her permission.
There's lots of minor nuanced secrets in this game, and it just adds further and further layers of depth. And if you haven't taken the time to play it, I highly recommend doing so. As someone that was skeptical about it from the beginning, it was an amazing experience, and in my opinion, one of the best visual novels or any kind of storytelling game released in 2017 when it came out.
Yeah.
It's no doubt one of the most notorious indie games within the last 5 years. And that's noted just due to the fact of there was multiple news headlines and articles being written about the fact that Doki Doki comes off as this lighthearted game. People weren't paying attention to warnings and were getting frightened to the point that modern media was making comments on it.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have a game that's being so widely recognized as an indie title that these more mainstream news outlets are commenting on it, you're definitely doing something right. Whether it be going ahead and using forms of disillusion to go ahead and give you a feeling of safety within the first run through,
Mm-hmm.
or going ahead and scaring you to the point of not knowing what's going to happen next and being directly talked to by a computer.
Mm-hmm.
There's so many layers to this game that can't really be expressed in other ways. And I think having gone through roughly this whole game, we can go ahead and start talking about some further points that came through.
Well, I do want to
like Jaff, I know.
one of the things that last thing I do think it's fair before we get into the really deep stuff to talk about some criticisms we might have of the game. Is there anything about the game that in particular you are not a fan of?
It's more of a visual nitpick than anything.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't a fan of the use of a lot of purples and reds in flashing glitch sequences within the game. And the main reason behind that is because those colors tend to go ahead and trigger things when people have issues in terms of flashing lights.
Yeah.
Other than that, I haven't had too many criticisms of the game, other than that it's a slow start. Is that the first initial playthrough of the dating sim until you get to the point where it's revealed that Sayori's depressed, I believe took me about an hour or so, maybe a little bit longer, but that first hour was, it almost felt like filler because it wasn't really anything that I cared about. The part that I enjoyed of this game was that feeling of a rabbit hole of going deeper and deeper, trying to understand what's happening. The dating sim aspect of it, I feel, was the weakest part, but it was there so it could go ahead and bamboozle you into not thinking there's anything more.
I would like to point out that's because this is also not the general type of game that you're a fan of. Whereas, like,
Agreed.
I feel like that experience would be very different from someone that enjoys visual novels and this sort of stuff. Funny enough, one of my big criticisms with the game is actually kind of the exact opposite. I feel like the first part of the game, from a sheer technical standpoint, from a sheer productive standpoint, is the strongest part of the game. When you still have Sayori, when you're just going through the game, from waking up on the first day and meeting Sayori, all the way through Sayori taking her life, feels like the game is really well polished and very smooth. And then when the reboot happens, I know there's an argument you could be made where that this is because the game is falling apart and breaking, but it feels like a lot of the polish just was not there. Like a lot of there weren't that many effects in the first part, and there were a good number of still images that they have, the CGs, and they started adding effects to sort of like catch people off guard and surprise people. There's a time where one of the characters' eyes bleeds. There's a time where their faces sort of spaz out. And like at the time when you're like in the experience, you're like, oh wow, yeah, that really catches you off guard. But when I was watching Andrew play through it, a lot of it was just kind of comical how it looked.
I can agree with that because one major point I liked about the game, even though I'm not a fan of visual novels, like you said, the first portion of the game was very well polished. It's artistically a very nice looking game.
Mm-hmm.
It's especially the backdrops within the game of this. Like, obviously, there's not going to be too many changes in how they display the characters. It's a visual novel. Generally, they're given 3 to 5 different poses that they'll use throughout different situations until a serious event happens, and then you might have a render of like a singular screen grab.
Well, remember all the
But every
times that you had a scene with Yuri where you were sitting at the desk with her, the time that you were sitting on the floor with her and you fed her the piece of
yeah,
chocolate, the time she
listen,
came over. The later part of the game doesn't have anything exclusive like that, other than a couple of character images that are just the ones that normally are on screen, not the full CGs, but the character images. For example, again, self harm warning. There are a couple of times where the on screen image of Yuri is her with her arms cut up because she is self abusive. She does cut herself, and that's something that you can run into at one point in the game.
and that's something where I was going, which is the initial part of the game where you have these small interactions is very beautiful, but when you get down to the point of these effects, they're very, there's no other way to put it besides cheesy.
Yeah.
But in the moment, it's effective. But watching back or going ahead and thinking about it, the effects aren't very well done, but they're effective. It's it's almost like going ahead and trying to draw a famous painting in Microsoft Paint. You can do a fairly good job. You can make it passable so you can convey the idea you were trying to talk about, but at the end of the day, it's Microsoft Paint.
I actually want to kind of paraphrase someone that I follow, H Bomber Guy, who recently did a video on Pathologic, where he talks about the poor visual quality of the game, even for the time, how it looks like very kind of an ugly game. And there's some arguments as to that being intentional. Like I said, you could argue that the game being less polished once Monica starts messing with stuff more drastically is an intended part of the game, but similar to what he said about it, if that part of the game had been more polished, I don't think we'd be saying that part of the game should have been uglier. I don't think we'd be saying like it looked too much like Monica knew what she was doing and the world was being properly designed. So it's kind of like a post hoc justification, right? Like, it's excusable, but that's exactly what it is, excusable. Like, I don't think that it needed that. It can just get away with it.
And that's something that, even though it's a visual novel, great writing leads itself to. It's able to go ahead and get away with things that might otherwise not work in other situations because the writing of this game is so strong.
Mm-hmm. My other major criticism of the game is Natsuki. So, transition the like on that note of the writing being strong, Natsuki, in my opinion, is the weakest part of the writing of this game. Her character is less fleshed out. I think she's just generally less interesting. She has less stuff to say. Her storyline is less meaty compared to like Sayori and Yuri. I like her poems. I like the interactions you have with her poems. Those are very interesting. She's very thought-provoking there. But if you actually were to pursue her romantic line, I think that's a bit less interesting. I think the bad end that can happen with Natsuki is, I don't remember exactly what it is, but I remember it being like very underwhelming compared to the one that happened with Yuri. And go ahead.
From the research I did,
Mm-hmm.
to make it known to anyone listening, when I did this playthrough, I had pursued Yuri,
She's got
and
a
I don't
really
know.
big personality.
huge personalities, a little bit over the top in some regards, but quiet and reserved. Um, when doing some research into the game about some of the other lines of play that I could have taken, when looking into Natsuki, there was some interesting material there. So I'm curious what it was about her storyline that you found lacking.
I think my single biggest criticism of her is her, and I hate using this word, but I just cannot figure out a better way of putting it, her defect, right? Sayori had depression, and Yuri was self harm, and both of these were influenced by Monica. Like, Monica pushed Sayori more into depression. She pushed Yuri to be more mentally unstable. Natsuki's thing, she's sort of like this small, petite, child-looking character compared to all of the others, and the explanation for that is that her father's basically abusive via absentee. Like, he's never around. There's never food in the house. That's why she's so small, is because she grew up malnourished and underdeveloped. And the problem I have with that is this is also the character that bakes for everyone.
Yeah.
So I think that's a really big part of my criticism with the game. Like, that doesn't jive to me.
Yeah, that's definitely a very valid criticism. Now that we've gotten these
Initial
initial
reactions
points
way.
out of the way, we got our pros, we got our cons, as well as just ideas around the general medium and story of the game. Now we can kind of get into our initial discussion points. I know you had a really interesting piece.
Mm-hmm.
So why don't we go ahead and start with yours?
So the heading I have for this is what counts as appropriate criticism and analysis of a work of art. What I mean to say there is there's a lot of talk with agency of characters, right? Katniss is a very famous example of recent years that a lot of people say she doesn't have very much agency. Stuff just happens to her. She doesn't go out of her way and do things. I actually saw a fairly interesting piece that compared Twilight and the Hunger Games, and pointed out that, like, as much as everyone tends to hate on Twilight and how popular Hunger Games was at the time, Katniss was not a very empowering character because she was very passive. Things happened to her and she just went along with it. She did not make decisions. She was just there. Whereas, I want to say Bella, Kristen, whatever the girl in Twilight was, her character actually would go out of their way and make decisions. You know, say whatever you want about the writing in the game in general. That character had agency. So let's look at
Also,
Doki Doki Literature Club in different levels, right? At the very base level, from the start of the game to Sayori taking her own life, what can we say about the agency of the characters?
so one of the things that I found in terms of agency of the characters was
Again, I want to talk specifically right now before up to Sayori taking her own life and not the agency of the game after that.
exactly. Before taking her own life, there isn't too much agency whatsoever, beyond the point of Sayori telling you about her depression and asking you to be with her. That is the most agency her character has, whereas everyone else, there isn't too much. I believe the closest you get to agency within the Yuri storyline is when Monica steps in and asks, "Oh, isn't going to get water for this kettle a one-person job?" And Yuri kind of asserts a little bit of a dominant standpoint, stating that, "Oh, I'm just trying to be inclusive, back off," kind of thing.
I would also make the argument that both Yuri and Natsuki have some limited agency in that they respond to you differently depending on which one you pursue based on your poems. For example, like, Natsuki does just, like, start completely blowing you off if you pursue Yuri. Yuri kind of, like, condescends and looks down on you if you pursue Natsuki with the simpler poems, that sort of stuff. So I would say there's some amount of agency there. Monica is a character who doesn't really have much agency. She, like, tells people this is what we're doing and that's basically it. No major decisions happen with her. The one time that anything choice related happens with her, where you can choose to spend time with Monica, Natsuki and Yuri get mad and say that she doesn't need your help, and they push her back, and she just sort of submits. She's like, "Okay, fine, I guess you're right." Um, and that's a really interesting subversion for what happens next, because, as we've mentioned multiple times, Monica has awareness of this being a game. She actually is the only character here with agency. She's the one like pushing Sayori into depression. She's the one making Yuri mentally unstable. That sort of stuff. So, as that, um, she's like the only character with any sort of real agency compared to the others.
The way that I would describe it is Monica has what I would personally consider to be retrospective agency. When you're playing through the game initially, it doesn't appear that she has any agency until you get to the point where she reveals that she's aware.
Mm-hmm.
Because until then, you think she's just been passive, she's been around, she's another character there to help explain things to you. But when it finally gets down to the point where all of the other characters have been taken away and you're left with just Monica and she's talking to you, you realize that every step that's been taken, regardless of your own choices, has been manipulated by Monica to get what she wants. And when you hit that point, it kind of all clicks together that not only was it, as a player, your agency of going ahead and interacting and taking these choices, no matter what, Monica was going to go ahead and make choices of her own to go ahead and get you where she wanted.
Yeah, that's one of the things I like, is that Monica, in the context of the fiction, is the only character with agency, and that includes you. You did not have a real choice. You had some illusions of choice between Natsuki and Yuri and Sayori a bit, but you went to her conclusion. She was the one making all of the real decisions.
And that's something... Sorry, I'll let you go
I
ahead.
just think the illusion of agency and the removal of agency is a very interesting thing that video games can do. BioShock is notorious for this, where it's a game where literally I think the only time you lose control of your character is when the bad guy is on screen and says, "Would you kindly do this?" And then you lose control of your character and it does what he tells you to do. And that ends up being a major plot point later on. But that's a very interesting way of conveying that sort of stuff, where it takes away your control over the character to make a point. Stanley Parable has some stuff like this that I was about to say, but I'm not going to go into it because we're going to do that for a later episode.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one point I wanted to really touch on there, where it gets to the point where Monica is the only true character with agency. One of the things that I wanted to go ahead and touch on was that this game has real parallels to another popular form of media. When you think back of it being the popular movie The Matrix. And the reason behind that is because Monica is aware that this is all a game, whereas in The Matrix they're aware it's a simulation. So realizing that she's in a game and has control over these elements, this agency allows her to go ahead and do things that normally would be seen as immoral, but knowing that she's the only one that truly has agency or a sense of free will or whatever you may call it, lets her go ahead and commit these horrible, horrible things like getting Sayori to go ahead and commit suicide or making Yuri self-harm. She's able to do these things without remorse because within the eyes of Monica, Monica would be seeing this as this is her world. So, she is the one in control.
So does sentience is cruelty towards non-sentient beings cruelty, I guess is what I want to say. Because like, I think outside of the... So there's multiple layers of the fiction of the game, right? And like in the most basic layer of fiction of the game is that all of these girls are, all these characters are actually there, they're girls, and they are sentient in that. And then when you step back to the next level of fiction of the game, Monica is the only one that's there. That's an actual character that makes any decisions. She's the one that understands what's going on. She's the one that has free will, in theory, compared to all of the others. So, are you just saying that Monica can do that sort of stuff without remorse? Or are you saying that it's fine that she did that because the moral implications of harming something that in a sense can't feel harm is not as bad?
The main point I was initially going to make was that she's doing it without feeling remorse. That being said, doing it to something that she feels might not be able to actually feel the harm she's causing might be a way for Monica, if Monica was a person, to justify that to herself. That being said, you made a note of, I'm not going to be able to phrase it the exact way you did, but going ahead and committing these acts on things that aren't sentient themselves, whether that's ethical or not. And I feel there's an interesting parallel there due to the fact of, if you step back from this game as a whole, society really thrives on things like the cattle industry and meat and other things.
Mm-hmm.
I know you and I have personally had this discussion before about the ethics behind eating meat.
Yeah, I don't eat animals.
You eat steak sometimes because, in your words, you are a flawed human being.
Yes. But that's like 4 or 5 times a year.
Exactly. It's an interesting perspective to take, because obviously you get to certain points of levels of thought where ethics begins to kind of not be so black and white.
Mm-hmm.
Like, for example, killing something like a cow, there's argument that cows can feel sympathy and other forms of emotions, so it's more cruel, but at the same time, they're not as aware in terms of like complex emotion, such as the understanding of their own death and things like that beforehand. At least not that we're aware of to the same level as humans. But if you compare that to something along the lines of an insect,
Right,
where
so
along the lines is this within taking a step back into the game with these other characters that don't have this agency and sense of free will fall within that scale?
and that's a really good question. And that's kind of hard to sort of talk about because of the layer of fiction. Because on the one hand, you want to just look at it and be like, oh, these are just characters in a game. Monica's the only one that's a real person in this fiction, so that doesn't really matter. But then you've got lines where Monica refers to them as her friends, and she sees that they don't have free will, and that's upsetting to her. So, like, where's that going? Like, is this more like a Matrixy thing, like you were mentioning earlier, where all of them really are people, and she's just the one that understands that they're plugged into the machine? Or are they not people and Monica is? And a lot of that can get really blurry, because the ending of the game, the standard ending, when Monica deletes herself and restores the other characters, Sayori basically realizes that it's a game now that Monica's out of the way, and kind of starts going mad with power before Monica comes back and decides to just delete everyone. So it's... And the question there is, like, was that Sayori going from, sentience but locked down into freedom? Or is she going from non-sentience into sentience?
I think going ahead and going from non-sentience into sentience is a point that could be more feasible in my eyes, due to the fact of, in a few brief moments, this character is now realizing such complexities that everything around them isn't actually real, as well as things like their own mortality within this world. And realizing those things in one abrupt moment is enough that it would cause anyone to go insane. So the initial scream that that character has as a reaction is only fitting to go ahead and realizing just the complexity of the situation around them.
All right, so all that taken into consideration, I kind of want to get to the ultimate point of what I wanted to get to with this segment. We can agree in the very base game, Monica has basically no agency. And then we can agree that past that, Monica is the only character with agency. Right?
Yeah,
Because
absolutely.
she's aware that she's a character in a game. How do we reconcile that with the fact that Monica, being a character in the game, has literally zero agency? This is not a fair criticism of making of most characters. For example, in Legend of Zelda: Skyward Sword, that's a game where Zelda has a lot of agency compared to certain. Like in the original one, she didn't really do much. In Ocarina of Time, she had a fair amount of agency when she was spoiler warning when she was Sheik. Uh, so we can definitely say that Zelda had agency in some games and less agency in other games. And it does not make much sense to say, oh no, she did not have agency because she's in a game. Or like, for Katniss, you can't really say, well, obviously she doesn't have agency, she's a character in a story. The girl from Twilight, obviously she doesn't actually have agency, she's a character in a story. That seems to be unfair criticism. But the fact that Monica is a character in a game cannot be divorced from who she is. Like, that is a fundamental aspect of her character, that she is aware that she is in this game. She's aware how the others don't have, sentience, how they don't have free will, that sort of stuff. But it's asking us to break through the fourth wall, but then still accept the fiction of the game. The way I have it written down, let's see, where did I write it down? It is asking us to suspend our disbelief while also suspending our suspension of disbelief.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I wanted to note, however, though, with stating that Monica has no agency, the way I worded it earlier of its retroactive agency, is it possible that she did have agency because it is revealed later on, but a comparison I'm going to use is it that we're just giving her credit for playing checkers when all along the character is playing chess?
I think that's a bit of a flawed analogy because she wasn't even playing checkers necessarily. She was following the script. She was following a scripted dialogue. And again, it's unfair generally to say a character in fiction does or does not have agency
Absolutely.
because that character is in the fiction and only has the one option, or in the case of video games, the couple of options that you determine and they do not. But the game acknowledges that sort of level of existence. It acknowledges the lack of agency of the other three girls. And it acknowledges that Sayori ends up getting that agency when Monica is deleted. So it's aware that characters in games don't actually have agency. So how do we sort of reconcile the fact where we acknowledge that Monica is a character in a game, and since she knows that she has all of the agency, but because she's a character in a game, she has no agency? I think that's one of the things that's like very interesting about Doki Doki Literature Club. Like I said, it's asking us to suspend our suspension of disbelief while still having some degree of suspension of disbelief.
It is a very interesting concept. And to your question of how we deal with that, the way we deal with that is by moving to the next discussion point.
All right. So the transition I have from that is what are the boundaries of art? This is sort of a similar vein. I'm mostly talking about things from like a philosophically aesthetic point of
Just
view. Um, what I mean by the boundaries of what are the boundaries of a work of art? And what I mean by that is when you have the EXE Doki Doki Literature Club running and you're playing the game, that's the work of art, right? You're playing that and you're experiencing it, right?
yeah, absolutely.
When
But
you
there's one thing I
when
do want to say.
Well, hold on. Let me
The
get
one.
to this point. If you want
Okay.
to take a note real quick, you can get back to it. when you close the game and go to the install file to delete Monica's character or mess with other stuff. For example, there's a secret ending where you start the game at the very beginning with Monica's character deleted. Sayori is immediately hit with all of that sentience and just freaks out and the game crashes. I think that's a pretty interesting thing. There are different things that you can do with messing with the different game files. But when you close the game, are you still playing the game as you go into the installation files? Like, is that distinct from the work of art, but still part of the experience? Or is that inseparable to the point where the act of leaving the work of art to interact with something that is not what is supposed to be the work of art, still part of that work of art? Like, we can all agree that art needs context. Like, there's the famous painting of the Campbell's soup can, and that art does not make sense without the context of consumerism and stuff like that. So art to some degree needs context, but like, is context the same thing as what the game is asking you to do? Because generally speaking, artworks don't ask you to do things. This is something unique to video games where it needs you to do stuff. And it's asking you to do untraditional stuff. Like, normally in a game, you run the game and you do stuff in the game. Even if you, like, you know... Basically, that's what I'm saying. Like, when you have the install file open, you can actually see Monica deleting Sayori's character file if you have that open at the time. When you're in the scene where Sayori takes her own life and you have that folder open, she deletes the character file, and the character file disappears from the folder. So where is the line where we would say, this is Doki Doki Literature Club, the game? Like, is it fair to say that there's a difference between the experience of a work of art and the work of art itself?
My take on this, I'm going to get to right after I address the initial point I was trying to say there, was I love how you start off the episode by saying, we're not going to tackle the question of high art today. But what are the boundaries of art?
Well, again, so for my purposes, I'm not worried about capital H, capital A, high art. I'm not worried about the discussion of whether or not video games can be art. When I say art, I mean all sorts of artistic-esque media. Pop entertainment is fine. Like,
I'm aware. I just wanted to touch on that light note there. That being said, one of the things that I really enjoyed was I feel like that folder that involves these character files is a part of the game. It's not just a part of the experience due to the fact that if you know about it beforehand, if you leave this folder open during the game, it's steadily updating and changing things, whether it be you're going to watch her say within the game that this character file is being deleted and it gets deleted, or within the game, the names of the files get changed at one point to say, I believe somewhere on the lines of, someone please help me. And
I actually didn't know. That's interesting.
And the changing of these files, and even though you interact with them, I believe it's still part of the game. Because as we established before, there's no such true thing as a character file. These 4 files are placed within this folder just simply as placeholder checks within the game. Basically says, is this file in this folder? Yes, then do this. If no, then do this. That being said, those 4 files where they're constantly changing and are attached to the story itself, and it's not something you have to go in and try and mod these different files in certain ways to tweak them, I feel is a part of the game, as opposed to being outside of it and being more a part of Doki Doki as an experience than as a part of the game, because it forces you to interact with them. And that being said, even though it's untraditional forcing you to interact with files not within the set display window with the art in there, I believe it's a part of the game just due to the fact that it's within the storyline and referred to in a situation more than once. And even when you're not actively doing anything with these files are changing on their own.
So let me ask you this. uh, as we're all aware, there's the Avatar movie by James Cameron that is a absolute visual experience. I saw it in 3D when it first came out. Absolutely breathtaking. I saw it at school later on a projector. Terrible movie.
Yeah,
So
the 3D experience is needed for that movie. I saw it, I believe,
right.
4 times in theaters in 3D because it's
Mhm.
that
So
breathtaking.
let me ask you this: Is are 3D glasses part of the movie?
They're not part of the movie because you can still enjoy the movie to a certain extent without actually going ahead and personally interacting outside of it. Like the glasses, you can go ahead and watch the movie still and enjoy it without getting the full experience, but it's still you're still able to experience this movie. It just takes it one step further, which is the similar to the files, which I now realize I am contradicting myself because you can enjoy Doki Doki Literature Club without messing with these
I
files.
was gonna
Just
say you
however, in
can.
doing so, you do get to the point where when you end, it is just Monica. You are in a room with just Monica, and until you delete the character file of Monica while you two are in the room, every time you boot the game, you're just in a room with Monica.
Yeah, that was one of the things that I was gonna say is that like video games are strange because you can. There's not a set ending, and the only other real media that can do anything like that is like choose your own adventure novels. Um, but like you said, you can argue that if you don't go ahead and mess with the mess with the files, that is just an ending of the game. You end the game as Monica's beloved for all of eternity. Like that's just the game. That's the ending of the game. It doesn't take you to like a full on conclusion, but that's kind of the end of it. And a similar comparison I would have to that is spoiler warnings for Undertale. By the way, I know this is coming kind of out of nowhere, but spoiler warnings
I
for
haven't
Undertale.
even played this game. You're spoiling me.
I mean, I don't have to say this if you don't want.
That's a go for it.
Okay, so if you go with the genocide ending of Undertale, where you kill everyone, uh, and then you go face Sans. Sans ends up being the final boss of the game, um, and basically you fight him, and it's a semi. It's like a Undertale's like kind of turn based, but also a bullet hell at the same time. Basically, you make your turn and then you do bullet hell stuff, and the ending, like the only thing that you can say of that is the ending of the genocide route is it is Sans' turn in combat. He's basically at minimal health, and he straight up says, "If I end my turn, you're going to kill me. I know that. So I'm just never gonna end my turn. I'm gonna stay right here." The ending of the game is it's still running. It's still Sans' turn in combat. There's no like you wait and he ends up taking it. There's no like, oh, I can do this thing where I'm attacking on his turn. Like that's the end of the game. It's not like a here's the end. There's no scrolling credits. It's not like the satisfying conclusion. It's not what you would expect for the game to end with, but that is the ending because there's nowhere else to go. So like how do you define the ending of a game? Is it when there is nowhere else to go, or is it when you can satisfyingly say the story has concluded even if there are ways of going past it?
I think it's when you, as a player or as a viewer of one of these games or movies or experiences, touching on the fact as well of choose your own adventure novels, uh, regular film media has touched on the choose your own adventure style as well recently, in terms of, I believe, 2 years ago, Black Mirror Bandersnatch being released.
Oh
So
yeah, Netflix
that's
did a thing. I
that
forgot about that.
that line is being closed a little bit. However, one of the things I wanted to make note of with the ending is it's really up to you to decide when it ends, because you could go ahead and watch, say, to draw back to the Harry Potter conclusion you made, you could go ahead and watch 3 of the 7 movies and say, after these 3 movies, I'm compelled enough with the storyline, I don't want to watch more.
See, I
And I
find
think,
that debatable because There's very clearly a story arc happening in Harry Potter that does not conclude until the end of the seventh book.
That is true, but there is the minor story arcs happening within each individual movie.
Sure, like each movie, each book, etc., has their own fairly self-contained thing. As it goes further on, that becomes less self-contained. I think around book 5 or so, you basically have to acknowledge 5, 6, and 7 are all connected. You can't really end at book 6 and say you've completed the story.
Absolutely. It's the way I'd like to go ahead and compare it is playing through Doki Doki. It's like chapters in a book. You could go ahead and after Sayori dies, no longer play anymore. You could say that's the ending.
Mm-hmm.
That would be the close of one chapter. Then the glitches start to happen, and when Yuri and Natsuki get deleted and you're stuck with just Monica, you could say that's also the ending. Then when you delete Monica's character file and go through, you could say that final ending there is the ending. Or there's the alternate one. There's multiple different endings.
Yeah, there is a secret ending.
Just to how within television, or mostly television, there's different seasons, and when a season ends, a lot of the time it feels like you can stop the show at that point because they might prepare for, in case the show gets canceled or not renewed, we make something that can pass as an ending.
Yeah, something I found out recently about BoJack Horseman, the reason that why that show is still so good is the fact that they intentionally designed each season to sort of like wrap up all the loose ends. They did not want to have a loose end hanging because they knew that, like, you know, there's always the possibility that they're gonna get canceled and the plug's gonna get pulled on them, and they don't want to have loose threads still in the show. So every time you go through the show, every season, they make specifically, like in the modern age, the idea that rather than here's the whole story that we have to tell, that's that, and that's going to be the end of the show there. But basically, it's almost like BoJack Horseman could be 6 different shows just about the same character from each season.
Absolutely. It closes off the story arc without going ahead and limiting potential growth for the character.
So where are the boundaries of art, Andrew? How are the books in Harry Potter connected? Are they one story or not?
The boundaries of art lie in the consumer of said art. The boundaries of art are limited by the limitations that you, as someone experiencing it, want to limit it. You could go ahead and say that when you go to a museum, looking at that painting alone is the art, or you could say that the experience of being in the museum surrounded by the art is art itself. The boundary of art is where you personally place it, because you can enjoy an aspect of art as far as you're willing to appreciate the situation that the art
you're now
places you
talking
in.
about the experience of art and not the work itself.
You may be right, but that being said,
that was the whole thing I was trying to draw this distinction on earlier. Like, is there a difference between the experience of art and the work in and of itself?
there is a difference in the experience, because going to a theater to watch a movie versus watching it at home, you're getting a different experience. One thing I'd like to say, though, to touch on like the boundaries of it, would you consider a picture frame part of the art?
So I'm really glad you brought that up, because I actually went to the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston a couple of years ago, and there was a painting, a particular painting of a woman walking in through a doorway, and the wood on the frame was made to be the doorway in the painting. So in that exact instance, yes, the frame is part of the artwork necessarily, but, you know, changing the frame on another thing may or may not, you know, change what it actually means. Like, for example, if you were to have like a really fancy, really nice, you know, high-strung, you know, high art painting in a very regal, golden-rimmed sort of frame, that's going to give a certain experience of that. But if you were to have that same thing in like a wacky doodle goofy Chuck E. Cheese picture frame where you get your picture taken and you put that in there, like, not only does that change the experience, it changes what the art is trying to say. Like, that's a different that is a, I would argue that is a different work of art at that point, because it's trying to convey something differently. It's no longer this high strung regal piece of art. It becomes a criticism or a commentary on something. There are different ways that you can interpret that. But I would argue, the original Mona Lisa in a really nice frame, and the Mona Lisa being put in a picture that you take at Disneyland and get printed out. Those are different artworks, even if it's the same artwork. Well, they're different artworks, even if it's the same picture, I should say.
It's like taking a look at a beautiful painting of Jesus next to the very commonly known throughout the internet meme restoration art of Jesus.
The Ecce Homo?
Yes. Also, I love your use of dialogue to describe picture frames of Wacky Doodle Chuck E. Cheese picture frame.
I mean, I was just trying to contextualize it, right?
So I think for a closing statement on this discussion from me, the boundaries of art are really limited to a boundary can be placed on art only so much as the creator wants it to. The boundary goes where the creator wants it, as opposed to how the consumer can really view it. Obviously, like the building outside the museum, you could say that the museum itself is a piece of art in terms of beautiful architecture, but you're not going to say that the museum holding the Mona Lisa is a part of the Mona Lisa.
So you're saying
because
the bounds of a work of art are where the author places them.
Yes.
And in another episode, we are going to tackle the concept of authorial intent and argue whether or not the author is dead.
Why do you do this to me?
So I believe you had I think we both had some stuff about simulated reality and AI that we wanted to talk about. Why don't you start with it, because you were talking about the Matrix stuff earlier.
We did go ahead and touch on simulated reality and AI. The main reason I had that there, which we really hit the nail on the head in terms of discussing agency. That there, I felt kind of wrapped up my initial point there. Was there something you wanted to go ahead and address in terms of AI before I go ahead and get into one of the notes I had?
There was earlier. I'm trying to remember what it was. Go ahead and get to your note.
Okay, well, my note was Doki Doki Literature Club puts itself in a strange place due to Monica having agency, that you can draw parallels to many other things. And one of the things that I found interesting was, if you look at the famous psychological study, the Stanford Prison Experiment, according to Zimbardo and his colleagues, who were some of the individuals running this experiment, the Stanford Prison Experiment demonstrated the powerful role that situation can play in human behavior. Because the guards were put in a position of power, they began to behave in ways that they wouldn't normally act in everyday lives or other situations, and the prisoners were placed in a situation where they had no control, and which made them become passive and depressed. And the parallel you can draw from this is Monica having this self-awareness is in a position of power to go ahead and manipulate things around her, where Sayori, not having agency and a sense of knowing that she's in this simulation, a sense of self-actualization, slowly becomes depressed due to the fact that Monica has the power and control. And one of the interesting aspects I found about that is there's two people that have control within this game, and that is Monica as well as the player. Even though there's some things where you don't have a choice in, like having the choice to join the literature club, you do have choices in how you can maneuver through the story, which are going to impact the mental health or suffering that some of these characters is going to go through. So
that kind of brings us back to the point that I was making earlier about, like, where can we really draw the line of what's considered abuse or not? So, for example,
That's what I was going to
yeah,
get to, is what is considered an abuse of power by either Monica or the player in this situation. At what point of playing through making these choices do you get to the point where you are just as responsible for the things going on as Monica?
it's an interesting question. I don't know if you can necessarily make that argument. I'm going to say I don't know if you can actually say that you're responsible for what's going on as much as Monica, outside of the really early point we made, wherein Monica is just a character in a game. You're responsible for it because you're the one that launched the game and did not close it. But then again, that brings us back to, is that a fair analysis or criticism of the work? And where's the boundary of art there? Like, when do you actually say this is a fair conclusion to the work just because I'm done reading it? Like, if I were to read the first 3 chapters of the Harry Potter book, I'm like, well, the end is. I think it's unfair to say that I've read the story of Harry Potter.
Yeah, absolutely. A name went in the Goblet of Fire, the end.
Yeah. So.
You know,
I do want to just mention real quick for our viewers and listeners, the Stanford Prison Experiment. Correct me if I'm wrong. I believe what it was is the reason it's called the Stanford Prison Experiment because it is referring to the University of Stanford, where the experiment was arbitrarily some small number of students were designated to be guards and the others were designated to be prisoners. That's right, I believe?
Yes. So the Stanford Prison Experiment was I can't remember the exact number, but pretty much at random, some people were chosen to be guards and some people were chosen to be prisoners. And what the experiment was trying to prove was that when placed in a position of power, people will inevitably abuse said power. So by giving the guards the power to go ahead and have control over the people that were chosen to be prisoners, eventually they started doing things like withholding food, beating the people that were considered prisoners, and going ahead and just, without question, having mass abuse to this perceived power, even though in reality these people all signed up for an experiment knowing what was going to happen, knowing that some were going to be guards, some were going to be prisoners, and just really abusing the fact that they were given this minor semblance of power within this small part of their everyday life.
So just a bit of historical context. The Stanford Prison Experiment, along with some other stuff, is a big part of what sets regulations for what we're allowed to do for experiments today. Like, you literally, at least in America, could not do the Stanford Prison Experiment again.
Which is why there's so many pieces written on it,
There's
depictions
so much
in media. It's something where even people running the experiment stated that they got caught up within it by not putting a stop to it sooner due to just wanting to see what happened.
Mm-hmm.
It's such an interesting experiment in terms of just the way that the power is getting abused within a matter of, I believe it was 4 days. It was 4 days before things got so out of control that they had to start getting shut down, if I remember correctly.
Mm-hmm.
But the point of going ahead and being just as responsible as Monica is something where I'm definitely didn't word that in the way that was intended. You are right in you can't be just as responsible due to the fact of your option would it be to stop playing or to go ahead and say the story is done past this point. I will say, however, that due to also being in control, you are in a position of power, but the difference is within this position of power, as a human being, you have ethics. Whether your ethics, whether you are a very...
So
I'm trying to find the word here. Whether you have...
this for you.
Yes.
Why there's still a very strong argument, an ethical argument, for vegetarianism and veganism, even though animals eat other animals, we are not just the very baseline. Like we do have the ability to survive without eating meat. We do have the ability to actually produce enough vegetation for that. We do have the ability to understand what is and is not suffering in other creatures and what is and is not harming them. Whereas others don't necessarily have that full extent of understanding. I will admit this is a rather sapien centric worldview, and I believe there is a fair amount of criticism out there on it. I have not kept up with those circles of philosophy and biology, but that's basically the idea, is that since we have that neurological sophistication to understand why killing a cow for sustenance when we have other options is wrong, we have that responsibility because we know it.
See, what I was trying to make, you did a really good job of summarizing what I was trying to say. But the main point I was trying to state is because as humans, we know that we have a sense of morality. We also know that even though she's self-aware, these are all just characters within a game.
Mm-hmm.
Can we go ahead and say that Monica was doing unethical things from Monica's perspective? Is a character within a game, even when they're aware that it's a simulation, in a state where said character would have ethics?
So again, I think that does bring us back to the much earlier point of what are the other girls considered. And I was actually, one of the things I was trying to do research on for this episode as well is the personhood of AI. And I'm pretty sure there's a lot more out there on it that I just couldn't find. But I know apparently there's some places and movements trying to get like citizenship allowed for AI. Apparently in Saudi Arabia in the past year or two, Saudi Arabia had an AI robot granted citizenship. And that's gonna be like a big part of it. So like, for example, would you say that you are being abusive? Are you committing an immorality when you load up Skyrim and walk around and kill random peasants and guards?
It's hard to say because knowing that it's a simulation and knowing that nothing there feels pain whatsoever, and that you're doing it even though it's not something that I'd recommend.
See, there's the tricky part.
Especially,
that's one of the things that I like about Doki Doki Literature Club, is that it really blurs the lines, because it's very easy for someone to say no, that you're not doing something, you're not being abusive, you're not doing something unethical, playing Skyrim and hurting people, because there's this separation of the fiction and reality. But in Doki Doki Literature Club, like, you can say that you're not doing anything abusive. You could argue that the Dragonborn, or whatever their name is, the person that you're playing in the game, they're being abusive. That's a very strong argument you can make. But the fact that there's multiple layers of fiction in Doki Doki Literature Club, like there's the fiction of the world, and then there's the fiction around the world, and then we see all of that as fiction. Like there's the actual visual novel of Doki Doki Literature Club. There's the psychological thriller of Doki Doki Literature Club, in which Monica is sentient and aware, and there is us playing Doki Doki Literature Club. So, from the most outside perspective, Monica has absolutely zero responsibility of what she did. She had literally no choice, but again, it does not make sense necessarily to judge the ethic and morality of characters based on the fact that they're in a linear story. So, that brings us to the next layer of fiction. So, Monica, we know, is the only one that has that sentience and that understanding of the world. She's the only one that recognizes this as a game, and she's the one that talks to you directly. She's the one that has the power to delete not only all the other characters, but herself as well. So, in this situation, are the girls in the original fiction of the game, are they the characters in Skyrim to us? Or are they the characters in Skyrim to your character in Skyrim? Because obviously Monica's aware that it's a game. She's in a sense outside of it, but still inside of it. Like, it does not make sense for us to say that we're being, and you can argue against this. You were saying that, maybe you are, but I would say you doing bad stuff in a game is not necessarily unethical. Because it's a game, because you can understand that distinction between fiction and reality. But there's that blur between the first and second levels of fiction in Doki Doki Literature Club that makes this such a confusing question. Are the characters in Doki Doki Literature Club to Monica, are they characters in a video game? Or are they her friends that she is just aware are plugged into the Matrix with her, and she's the only one that sees the data? She's the one that sees the numbers flying across the screen, and they don't.
I think that's the distinction that I was trying to make, but you worded a little bit better than I did.
I am pretty solid at the words Gooder making.
Yes, you are very good at words Gooder making. Like, does Monica see these other characters the way that Neo from the Matrix would see Morpheus? Or does she see these other characters the way that Neo from the Matrix would see a random bystander on the street within the Matrix? Does she see them as equals?
See, I'm not even sure if that's the right question to ask.
I think I misworded it again, because again, I don't make words gooder.
So basically it would be, does Neo look at the people in the Matrix from the degree that they're in the Matrix with him? Or, see, again, that's the really difficult part in this analogy, because
I think the analogy, we don't even need an analogy. I think the real question comes down to it is, Monica is aware that Doki Doki Literature Club is a game.
So my point is,
the real question is, what is Monica's reality?
That's a good one. The point I was trying to make with Doki Doki Literature Club versus The Matrix is that The Matrix, you have the fiction and the reality, and all of that's within the fiction. But Doki Doki Literature Club adds the extra extraneous level. You've got the fiction, and you've got the quote-unquote reality, and then you've got reality past that, and that would be the people watching The Matrix. And there's not any sort of conflict of interest or any issue or any idea that jumps between us and the fiction in The Matrix, because we're aware that we're watching a film. We're suspending our disbelief for that. And in the game, when we're playing with Natsuki and Sayori and Yuri and Monica, we're suspending our disbelief and saying, like, these are characters that have, feelings and emotions and their own needs and wants. We're suspending our disbelief that it's just data and images. But then it asks us, like I said, it asks us to suspend our suspension of disbelief, to acknowledge that this is a game. These are just characters. These are just pictures and data. But how is it that we can simultaneously acknowledge that this is a game from the perspective that Monica is pointing out, like the Doki Doki Literature Club is a .exe file. You went into the text file and found my stuff. These are character files. This is very clearly a game. Like, how do we acknowledge both that to be true, but also say that even if they don't have free will, these characters are still real characters. We should still look at them as people. That's the really difficult jump that you have to argue if you can make that or not.
I think you're right, and with that, I feel like we should go ahead and move on to just some closing thoughts.
Well, first, extraneous thoughts. Was there anything that you just had in mind that came up over the course of the discussion, or just a major point that we didn't get to anywhere?
Nothing in relation to the game. The closest I got was when you were trying to figure out the name of the lady from Twilight. You said
It's
Bella, Kristen. You got both. Her name is Bella, and the actress is named Kristen.
There we go.
You got both without knowing it. That being said, there wasn't too many other points that I really got here outside of that last question where what is reality to Monica?
Mm-hmm. And I do want to take us to the relevant quotes that we have there previously. So there's a song in Doki Doki Literature Club called Your Reality. It's the same song that's basically always playing in the background in different versions. And then the actual one, Your Reality, the real one, has lyrics to it and is sung in theory by Monica. So these are lyrics that Monica wrote with you in mind. And there are two sections of it that I had in particular that I think sort of still keep the water really muddled. So the first one was, this actually comes later in the song. The ink flows down into a dark puddle. How can I write love into reality? If I can't hear the sound of your heartbeat, what do you call love in your reality? And in your reality, if I don't know how to love you, I'll leave you be. So there's the sort of acknowledgement that there's a distinction between us and her in the game. Right?
There is that distinction. That being said, one thing I wanted to touch on was it does say later in the song, but in this world of infinite choices, what will it take just to find that special day?
That's earlier in the song, actually.
Is it?
Yes.
Man, that song got me so confused because of the 4 hours of Monica text that I read through every line of, by the way. Every line I read through within this research. I have been all over the place.
So that
from
was
the Stanford Prison Experiment to agency of video game characters to music theory within the writing of this song.
I read this entire article about emotional robots, and it was really interesting, but it gave me nothing useful for this. I'm kind of upset about that. But yeah,
one thing I will state. Go ahead and wrap up your point, and then I'm going to go ahead and go with something.
Oh, I was saying, in this world of infinite choices, in Doki Doki Literature Club, you have very limited choices. So to talk about a world of infinite choices, she has to be referring to the external reality outside of the game. Our world of infinite choices.
Absolutely. There's no denying that.
Again, one of the reasons that I love video games, and one of the things that Doki Doki Literature Club really can show us that other forms of media cannot, are it's very easy to have, fourth wall breaks where things are sort of acknowledged. It is much more difficult, because of the lack of interaction, for the fourth wall breaks to be a fundamental necessary part of the story. Even with Deadpool, when Deadpool talks to the audience, there's still not that weird blurriness between, fiction of the world, fiction around the world, and reality,
I totally get it. But one thing that I wanted to go ahead and say just now is similar to one of the quotes earlier on. The happy ending of the game, which is surprisingly shocking to get, shockingly hard to get to if you didn't already know how.
I would have loved to have seen the reaction of someone that came across it organically, because that's just the sort of player they are.
Absolutely. It sounds like something that'd be hilarious to see. But one thing that I wanted to go ahead and close off today's discussion with is the happy ending poem from this game is pen in hand, I find my strength, the courage endowed upon me by my one and only love. Together, let us dismantle this crumbling world and write a novel of our own fantasies. With a flick of her pen, the lost finds her way. In a world of infinite choices, behold this special day. After all, not all good times must come to an end. However, unfortunately, Book Club and today's episode does. That being said, does Doki Doki Literature Club get the Book Club seal of approval? In my eyes, absolutely 100%.
Obviously, I was the one that recommended it, so that my vote is already cast. But yeah, I think Doki Doki Literature Club is super interesting in both like the. So next week or next episode we're gonna be talking about Thomas Was Alone, which has some really interesting story things to it that have philosophical implications as well. But it's a very different game to Doki Doki Literature Club in that uh, Doki Doki Literature Club blurs the mechanical lines. Like you could have Thomas Was Alone as a movie. You could not have Doki Doki Literature Club as anything but a video game. And that's why I love this game so much. It shows you things that are possible with the medium. And with that,
So with
I'd
that
like to
being
say,
said,
if anyone listening in or watching has any further thoughts, if there's anything that you drastically disagreed with, is there any point that we didn't touch on that you wanted to comment on? Is there just something that you wanted to add, expand upon? You can reach us at bookclubbutt@gmail.com. That's bookclubbutt, one T in butt, @gmail.com. And we will try and take a look at some of that stuff and mention it before we jump right into Thomas Was Alone next time. But that's going to be the book club for today.
that is the book club. The one question I wanted to leave any listeners with is, in your eyes, with this game, where does the line of fiction stop and the line of reality begin? Thank you for joining us, and have a great night, everybody.